Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here. Now that you have completed the second part of your research project, you hopefully have a nice list of secondary sources, and you may be wondering, what's next? For the next part of your project, the task is to put together another bibliography, this one consisting of primary sources. So in this short video, I just want to give you a sense of what a primary source is and how you can go about finding some on the internet in order to round out your complete bibliography for your project. So the instructions for this particular assignment, part 3 of the research project, you want to locate 3 different primary sources that speak to the research question in your proposal. Once you find those 3 primary sources, you then put together a works cited page, just like you did for part 2 of this project, in accordance with Chicago footnote style, also sometimes known as notes and bibliography style. And once you have those 3 sources cited, you then have an opportunity to once again give me a status update on your research. You will let me know in a new proposal how your research question, how you're thinking about your topic has changed over the last couple weeks. I'm guessing in some cases there may be pretty substantial shifts in the way that you've conceived of your project. You might have a new question. You're hopefully figuring out ways to deepen your analysis, to sharpen the focus of the project. So I just want you to write up a short paragraph where you once again tell me what it is you're studying and how your thoughts about the project have changed. Once you have all of that, your primary source bibliography, your updated research proposal, you put it all together into a document and you submit it to me over Moodle by the end of the day, Sunday, October 4th is the deadline for this. So what exactly is a primary source? This is something that at times we find a great deal of confusion about. Some people distinguish between primary and secondary sources on the basis of the kind of source it is. Like they would say, for example, a newspaper article or a diary, that's a primary source, versus a textbook, that's a secondary source. The kind of source doesn't really matter. Anything can be a primary source. It can be a written text, it can be statistical data, it can be artwork or music, it can be some kind of artifact from material culture like architectural remains or skeletal remains for that matter. The only thing that makes it a primary source is the fact that it comes from the period that you are studying. Often when historians think about primary sources, they consider them to be kind of the raw data, the raw material on which we construct our accounts of the past. So primary sources are things that haven't been analyzed or interpreted or woven into some kind of historical account by a scholar. It's just the source itself, that raw data. Often people think of primary sources as things that give us kind of unmediated, unfiltered access to the person, the place, or the event that we're studying. So they would say things like diaries or memoirs or letters are primary sources. And they certainly can be. But again, what really matters is when was it written or made? If it's closer to the time period that you're studying than our time period, then it is a primary source. What matters is the date of publication or creation. Sometimes, to be sure, it can be difficult to distinguish between primary and secondary sources. It all depends really on the research question that you're asking. So, not to make things overly complicated here, but let's say, for example, I was reading a historical account of sexuality in 20th century Germany, for example. An account written by a historian. Most of the time we would say, that's a secondary source. And yes, it would be, because This is an account that consists of someone analyzing primary sources and drawing them together into some kind of narrative framework. But if I was doing a more historiographical project where I said, like, I want to know about how scholars' understandings of or approaches to 20th century German sexuality changed over time, those same books that in some instances would be a secondary source now could be considered a primary source. So sometimes the lines between secondary and primary get blurred. It does depend on your question, but for the most part, especially for this class, if it's something that comes from the time period you're studying, again, it is a primary source. It is eligible for your use in research. Okay, so how to find good primary sources. For the most part, when historians do research, they look in physical places for raw data, mostly in archives or libraries, and that's where you can find a lot of good primary source material. But unfortunately, a lot of those libraries and archives are closed right now due to COVID-19. And anyway, we don't really have an opportunity to get to such places in a one semester project. So we're going to be looking for primary sources on the internet. We're going to be looking for old texts and documents that have been digitized and made available to us at the click of our fingertips. And there are many, many available to us. This is a very good thing. And I just want to give you a sense of how you can go about locating some good primary sources for your research. So if you remember, when I made the first video in this instructional series, I proposed my topic as Ottoman sexuality in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The easiest way, I think, to find some good primary sources is to begin with your secondary sources. Look through the articles and the books in your secondary source bibliography and flip to the end of those things. Look through the works cited page or the references, sometimes the footnotes or the endnotes, and look if you see anything in there that is a primary source. And often you can do this just by paying attention to the dates of publication. So for example, in my hypothetical research project, one of the secondary sources I had was Dror Zevi's article, Hiding Sexuality, the Disappearance of Sexual Discourse in the Late Ottoman Middle East. I'm looking at the very end of this paper at the references section, and going through it, I see that there are a few things just in this first page that were published in the time period that Dror Zevi is studying, the late Ottoman period. In fact, there are 6 potential primary sources that I could try to find on my own. And one of the things that makes it so useful to look through your secondary source reference lists is that there's a pretty good bet that the question that you're asking is going to be addressed in the primary source. You picked your secondary source because it addresses the question that you're interested in. Those primary sources are probably going to be useful to you. So the next step is to see if you can actually locate any of these sources online. I, just out of the blue, picked this one right here. It's a book from 1893, or that's when it was published. It's called Early Voyages and Travels in the Levant. So I hop over to Google and I did a search. I just entered in the title of that book, plopped it into the search engine, and interestingly, one of the first hits that I got was on the website Project Gutenberg, which actually has a fully available digitized copy of the text for me to read right on my computer. It actually exists in several forms. I just went to the HTML version. I opened that up and voila, there it is. This book exists in full through the Project Gutenberg website. I can read the whole thing. I can read part of it. One of the nice things about online sources is that you can often do keyword searches, which is useful when you have a text that's hundreds and hundreds of pages long. You don't have time to read the whole thing, but there might be something specific that you're interested in. Once you find some useful keywords, you can just look for those and focus on that part of the text. Another cool thing about the materials on the Project Gutenberg website is that they list page numbers, so you can include them in your citations. Project Gutenberg is just one place online where you can go to find very old manuscripts and other kinds of historical texts. But there are other places you can go. I was curious about this, so I just did a quick Google search with the words primary sources in quotes, and then online, and then in quotes, history of sexuality. And the very first hit that I got took me to a library website at the University of Geneseo, which is in upstate New York in the US. A professor teaching a class called The Body, Science, and Sexuality as History had on the library website compiled a list of other websites that contain lots of primary source materials on the topic of sexuality. So I went to this website. I scrolled through the page a little bit. One of the things I found is all of these different reference sites that you can click on and, well, let's see if they have some primary source materials. So I went through this list and I thought maybe, because my project is a little bit dealing with the medieval period, that I would click there. Actually, I tried to click on it and the link was broken. So I just, in my quick workaround, took those terms, Internet Medieval Sourcebook and Sex and Gender. I popped that into Google and I was led here to the Fordham University website, which has an online database. It's basically a library of lots of different primary source materials related to medieval sexuality and gender. I spent a few minutes poking around on this website, and after that, I found 2 more sources that I could potentially use for my research project. And again, you can read these in full right on the website. The first one that I found was an excerpt from Sir Richard Francis Burton, who translated the text of the Arabian Nights in the late 19th century. I thought, okay, this could potentially be useful. Obviously, I have to read through part of the source at least to know if it's going to address my research question. But you can do that right from the comfort of your computer. And I also found another text from the early 20th century British sexologist Edward Carpenter, which talks about the sexuality that he observed in Islamic societies from his 1908 book called An Anthology of Friendship. Again, I don't know how useful these are, but simply searching for online reference lists, online databases of primary sources, I was able to come away with some good primary source material, hopefully. A third option, there are lots of what we often call source books and readers, which are anthologies or collections of primary sources. And these exist for a variety of different historical topics, including history of sexuality. On the screen here, you're looking at one of the more famous of these source books. It was edited by Matthew Kufler and has been reprinted several times. In looking at reference works like this, these source books and readers, you may not be able to access them online, but usually you can look through the table of contents to see if anything useful would be there. And if you suspect that you do come across something useful in one of these source books, you can go over to our library website, and just as you might have done with your secondary sources, you can put in a request at ILL and have that source delivered to you. In my case, looking through this particular source book, History of Sexuality, I found a 16th century excerpt from a primary source written by an Ottoman writer who talks about sexuality. So there again, another useful source for me, potentially. Again, I have to read through it. All right, last thing, I wanted to give you a sense of how to cite some of these sources. Just follow the information here and you'll have it for yourself.